I guess it becomes clear after these days that when we are discussing what we are searching for is something very various and very different kinds of stuff we are searching for out there in outer space. And in this talk, I will talk about biosignatures, what we could know about biosignatures. So what I address is the epistemological questions around biosignatures. And in epistemology, we study what we can know and what we possibly can know in practice or in principle, and what we can know, what we don't know, and what we will never know. So what can we say about biosignatures, and why it's problematic with biosignatures? Because we are talking of very different kinds of stuff. It could be a dead life, it could be a living life, it could be you could find it in situ, or you could find it by remote sensing. It could be something that is still alive, or have never, or have stopped living. And it could also be found within our solar system, but also outside our solar system, and could also be of various kinds of magnitudes, from atomic magnitude to complete planets, or perhaps even solar systems. So it's very different. It could be chemistry, it could be physics, it could be physical structure, morphological structures, but it also could be chemistry, molecules, and spectra, and so on and so on. You know this much better than me. So what we are talking about, what kind of problems is involved here? And I will address 4 epistemological questions around biosignatures. And the first is about concept, and the second is analogy, and the third is perception, and the fourth is semiotics. And I will return to these questions very soon. But if we are searching for life out there in outer space, we ask ourselves, what is life? And if we are searching for life, we should at least have some kind of clue what kind of phenomena it is, and have a definition of it. And one of the most popular definitions of life is the NASA working definition: a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. I will not go into this question, how we could define life, and I have no answer to it. But this is one of the most discussed conceptual issues in astrobiology, and there is no consensus around it. And why? That's the question. And what's the problem to define life? And I see 3 difficulties involved in trying to define life. The first is, what do we mean with definition? What should a definition do? And what should we have definitions for? And the second is about categorization, the human ability or will to categorize, and seeing hierarchies between things, how our minds are perceiving the world, and trying to find the categories in our perception of the world. And the third problem is the empirical knowledge, our lack of knowledge, and our knowledge that we have. So what do we mean with definition, and what should it do for us? A popular and a common way of trying to find the definition, that's perhaps the usual way, is to see it a little bit like Aristotle did in the antiquity, as a limited list of characteristics that are both necessary and sufficient for something to be a type of object it is, and from which all the characteristics of the object originate. So you could say it's a list, it's a recipe. There is a number of things that should be included in order to define something to be alive or a living thing. There's a list of ingredients. So we are looking for these necessary ingredients. But the problem is that we don't use these kinds of definitions in ordinary life. Usually we are more like having a prototype theory or family resemblance. According to Wittgenstein's theory, family resemblance theory, he's saying that there are things, there are characteristics among a group of items that no one have all of them, but share some of them together. Like in a family, we are not identical, or we don't have all the ingredients, everybody in a family, but we share some ingredients. So there are family resemblance. Another way of trying to explain what the concept is the prototype theory that was put forward by Eleanor Roche, saying that we actually have a prototype in our mind. So if I ask you to think about something, life, probably you will, some kind of mammal turns up in your head. That's a very typical prototype of what life is. So we have a kind of prototype theory usually in mind when we are searching for life. And our prototype for life is, of course, life here on Earth. So a definition of life should encompass all the life we know. But it's not enough with that. It should also be anticipatory. It should also be useful for deciding if we encountering some new phenomena out there in space, we should have a tool for deciding if this is life or not. So it should also encompass a life that we don't know, and perhaps weird life. And that's the problem, how we do it. The second problem with the definitions or with the concepts is our categorization of our categories, how we categorize things. And because we need a tool to be able to handle this chaotic world around us. So we need to categorize things and seeing similarities between things. And these categories are not outside in the world, it's in our heads, our way of categorizing things. So that's there is a interaction between our categories and now in our minds and the world outside. And it's not necessarily so that these categories outside there in the world are the real ones. That's something we invent. So the human mind tends to categorize and seeing hierarchies and similarities between things out there. But we have also, we don't have so much knowledge about life out there. So the question is that how to distinguish those general characteristics of life in the universe from those that are specific to our own life here on Earth. How could we distinguish those ingredients of life here on Earth? Are they unique for our kind of life, or are they universal? And without a second sample of life, we can't really know if these ingredients that we think life needs is really unique or universal. The big questions, of course, when we are searching for biosignatures is to distinguish true biogenic signatures from abiotic mimics. That's the main questions. And it's, of course, involved the question of defining life is a part of that problem. So we need to avoid false positives that mimic life, and we should also avoid false negatives that real signatures of life are overlooked, that we can't we don't see them. The second problem, if that was the first problem about concepts, how we are using concepts as human beings, the second problem we have is analogy. And the analogical arguments is a kind of search for similarities, a way of selecting feature in the source domain that are believed to be the most relevant ones and transferring relevant properties from the source to the target. And you could say that astrobiology is one grand, giant analogical argument. We start with the only example of life that we know, life here on Earth, and from that only sample we go on and transfer or mapping this knowledge on the unknown out there in universe and searching for something similar to our environment. We are searching for an Earth twin. And that could be a quite good way of starting a discovering the world out there in space. But it's not a logical, valid argument. It's not a way of proving anything. It could be a way, have a heuristic way of searching and a way of discovering things, but it will never prove that life is out there. If we have a list of ingredients that we think life needs, like water, and it should be a specific temperature, and it should be carbon-based, and so on. If we could list these things, we don't know if we know all the ingredients that need to be included, or which of these ingredients are necessary and which are optional. And we restrict ourselves also for ourselves to one particular sort of life that we happen to know, life here on Earth. And we might also overlook other forms of weird life out there if we start from this analogical thinking. And of course, even though we have all the ingredients, we can't predict evolution. It has some stochastic events involved in evolution. So even though we have the right ingredients for life on an exoplanet, we don't know if it will take that path that our evolution did. And in history, we have many examples of analogical thinking. And it started actually this day, 30th November 1609, when Galileo looked at the moon and saw that the moon was not a perfect sphere. It was not a smooth, didn't have any smooth surface. Instead, it had mountains and valleys and perhaps seas and fields. And from this observation in telescope, he did the first observations of the moon through the telescope. People began seeing the similarities between the planets in our solar system. So if moon have the same qualities that our planet has, why couldn't there be life on the moon? And in the 18th century, people were also looking for life at Venus because people knew that Venus was quite similar to our Earth. It was of the same size and people thought it had an atmosphere and also mountains. Some astronomers thought that Venus had a companion moon. So there were a number of characteristics of Venus that both Venus and Earth shared. So why couldn't it be life on Venus as well? And Camille Flammarion, a French popularizer of astronomy, he said in 1862, if Venus were without population, then the Earth must be similarly lacking. And reciprocally, if the Earth were populated, Venus must be populated also. And my third epistemological problem I see in astrobiology that we need to think about is the epistemic perception. In a book from 1686 by Fontenelle, the secretary of the French Academy, he said that all philosophy, and he means natural sciences, is based on two things: curiosity and poor eyesight. And we want to know more than what we can see. And that's one of our problems, that we can't really see everything we want to see and want to know about. But we are eager and curious to find more about the world around us. So in here, say something about our way of perceiving the world, that it's the things we get from the outer world through our senses. It's not something neutral, something objective. It needs to be processed in our brains. We need to have a theory and have an interpretation of what we are seeing. And a famous example is here the face on Mars that Viking 1 saw or took a photograph from the surface of Mars that we intuitively interpret as a face. But when the Mars Global Surveyor passed the same area in 2001, they saw that this mountain was just a illusion. Because we are trained as human beings to see, looking for certain patterns, and especially faces are typical things that we are adapted to read and to understand, because our biological and cultural evolution. In the search for signs of life on Venus, people were searching for structures on the surface of Venus that could be signs of mountains and an atmosphere. But perhaps the most best example of this epistemic perception, that our knowledge or preconceived conceptions forcing us to interpret the observational data in a particular way, is this the Canals of Mars, and Schiaparelli, who did a map from 1888, and you could see below the photograph of the same planet Mars. And Antoniadi, a French astronomer, he compared Schiaparelli and Lowell's maps of Mars with his own observations, and he couldn't find any real correlation between these canals and the real surface. So is Professor Lowell deceived? Here's an example how we interpret some patches and try to find a structure in it. If you go even smaller here, it becomes more clear that if you try to bind together these patches and see something that is have a structure that we can think is canals. So the problem was not the telescopes. The problem was the brain, the human brain, our interpretation of what we are seeing. That was the thing that was a problem for these observers. I have a final example of where I think we need an epistemological discussion of biosignatures, and it's about the semiotics based on Peirce and Saussure, the French semioticians. When we are searching for biosignatures, it's not only the expression, the sign of life we are searching for. The sign of life stands for the content, the real or actual life. But we have a third component, ourselves, interpreter. So we need a person who find and establish this connection between the expression and the content, and it's the human being. So this connection between the biosignature and life is not only out there in the world, it's within our heads. It's we human beings who establish these connections between expression and content. So that's what I wanted to say today, that we need perhaps to discuss these epistemological questions, how we could go around it. And I stop there because we have time for some questions. Thank you.